don't think y'all, as far as that. We know that Samuel served as a judge, a prophet, and a priest. And he was the bridge between the book of Judges. And, of course, God gave him the authority to anoint Saul as the first king. And Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, which is the youngest son of Jacob. The city of Gibeah was his hometown, and he was anointed as king. And here's just a question he threw in here. What images does the description of a king invoke in you when you hear the word king? Well, all of us grew up not having a king. When I think of king, I think of England. And
they wanted to make George Washington king.
That's true. That's exactly right.
Don't you kind of make feel like a king is a tyrant?
And in some ways they are. But if you got a good king, then he can be a blessing. But we watched that Crown series. I don't know if y'all watched it on TV. Anyway, talking about when Elizabeth became queen and how she became queen and all the stuff going on. Pretty interesting, stories. Now, the picture of the two oxen here are here for a reason, because in the next verse, as Saul begins to take over as king and to rule, he took a yoke of oxen and cut them in pieces and sent them throughout the territory of Israel by the hand of messengers, saying, "Whoever does not come out after Saul and after Samuel, so shall it be done to his oxen." Now, when Israel came in from the wilderness, what was that? That wasn't me, was it? I moved and I thought my button turned on my horn, but when they came in, they had 12 tribes. They got their land divvied up. But there was no king. And, of course, kind of each tribal head took care of their people until they died. And then the next one in line came along. But they still had enemies all through here that from time to time they needed assistance from the other tribes. Now, the kind of government they had is what we call a confederacy. Con means against central control. That's what it means. So you don't have a dominant king or tyrant or whatever, and yet you still have to have some kind of governing. And in this case, they were a little resistant. So since he was anointed as king, they sent out an imperial edict to say that, you've got to give your religion. You wanted a king, and if you're going to resist, then if you want to have your animals, you better listen. So in 1 Samuel 15, then Samuel said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you as king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore listen to the words of the Lord." And the first thing he has to do is fight against Amalek. He says, "I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel and how he set himself up against him on the way while he was coming up from Egypt." And the Amalekites, if you remember, were the first ones down here that Israel had to fight. And, of course, Israel was successful before they went into the wilderness. But God is wanting to remove them from being a threat to Israel. Now, I saw today, I don't know if y'all did, but I heard that Israel's pulling most of its troops out of Gaza. They're going to leave, what was it, a regiment of soldiers to clean up, the few terrorists they got left. They're getting pressure put on them all around the world to get, stop it. And we talked a little bit about that in Sunday school this morning. He told Saul, "Go and strike Amalek and utterly destroy all that he has, and do not spare him, but put to death both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." Verse 3. How would you deal with that if someone was lost and came to you and said, "Why would God kill the whole family?" Have you ever read this?
I'll be honest, I've always wondered what they did to deserve
You weren't worried about the babies and the women.
Like,
No, I'm worried about the babies. I'm
it's like
worried
the
about
people,
the animals.
yeah, it's like the people in Gaza. You know, there's millions there. Not all of them are members of Hamas. And, you know, but look at the suffering they're going through. And I can see some pressure there. But innocence always.
Well, the things that I read, though,
We was talking about Vietnam the other day, and we lost over 55,000. The Vietnamese lost over 2 million. Yeah. But the Vietnamese people, they lost over 2 million people. And not all of them were Viet Cong, and not all of them were North Vietnamese. They were families that you know,
Children,
and so,
it's just war, though.
but you know, that's war, and you got your,
well, what's interesting about this took place at the beginning with it.
this was from God. telling
This is a 40-year judgment against them. This is, for some people, hard to comprehend. We've been watching, I don't know if y'all have seen some of these series that are on Amazon and Netflix. And anyway, there's a lot of them on there now about the Jewish situation during World War II. I mean, there's a bunch of them. And I told her the rise of anti-Semitism is happening as we sit here. And I said, and looking back, and we are just appalled at how they were treated and how people tried to help them. You know, they took kids, you know, it didn't matter, and just gunned them down.
What happened back then, it seemed like there was a tremendous amount of cruelty. Go back to World War II, Germany.
That's what we're talking about is Germany.
It was just ridiculous.
Yeah.
The cruelty that, I read some histories on some of the POWs from the Japanese and from the Germans. In Donaldson Air Force Base, some of them. The guys that came back that were wounded and all. Some of the things that happened to them
Hmm.
just as cruel as what we read about in the Bible.
Yeah. Well, this is, yeah. Well, this is, Islam calls it a jihad. Okay. The Jewish version is called a harem. That's the Jewish term. A harem, where God orders Israel to eliminate down to everything. So there's no influence and, of course, you know, judgment and so forth. So Saul defeated the Amalekites, and from Havilah, as you go to Shur, which is east of Egypt, he captured Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. So he did what he was supposed to. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good, and were not willing to destroy them utterly, but everything despised and worthless that they utterly destroyed. What did he tell them to destroy? Everything.
especially the king.
Right. Right. And Samuel said, "Has the Lord as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams." So what is God telling Saul through Samuel? He says here, you know, does God really, in other words, our sacrifices, our acts of worship, are they that really important? Or is obedience to God more important than that? Obedience to the Lord. And that's what he's saying, behold, to obey is better than anything you could ever do for God. Just obey his word, what you understand and what he says. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and insubordination is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you've rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. So from this point forward, his kingship is in jeopardy. Pretty, I guess you'd say, serious judgment against Saul. As Samuel turned to go, Saul seized the edge of his robe, and he tore it, so that Samuel said to him, The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to your neighbor who is better than you. And who's his neighbor he's talking about? David. So Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom and has given him to your neighbor. And he said he's better than you. And then, of course, we have the Goliath narrative. And I think a lot of us know this story, so we'll probably move on through it. That's a pretty good picture showing the size of him versus them. This is the area where the battle supposedly took place in Israel. And in 17, somebody summarize where David was at and how he came about getting into this battle from your Sunday school lessons. Let you participate. He was minding the sheep. He was the youngest of what? 12? Or was it 8 or 9? Is it 12 brothers? Was it? Okay, I can't remember. I thought it was like 9. But so he's the youngest, probably a teenager. He's left behind taking care of the sheep. His father's old. What's his father's name? Jesse. All right. So he's taken doing that, and he's supposed to go down and see his brothers, probably take some supplies and stuff. And when he gets there, he hears the confrontation of Goliath yelling across the battlefield. And what did David do when he heard all that? Huh? No, he took care of him, but there was a moment where he heard everything. He went to them, and he said, how dare this uncircumcised Philistine taunt the armies of what? The living God. That was his statement. Now, he's a teenager. They're all in fear, thinking Goliath's going to come across there and hack them up. This little teenager standing there. So if you're in the military, and some of y'all been in the military, what would be your thoughts if one of your soldiers went out before going to fight the Viet Cong, as y'all in Vietnam, and said, how dare these little, what was the other name they called them? Gooks, yeah. How dare these gooks taunt the armies of the most powerful nation on earth? Huh? He's crazy. Y'all think he was foolish, and y'all tell him he's going to get shot, and he probably would then. If you put it in that context, that's a pretty bold statement. But David's operating from the realm of faith, total faith.
God put that in David.
Yeah, he had the faith. So whenever he talked with them, they tried to put armor on David. Whose armor was it? Saul. And Saul was a big man. So when they tried to dress him up, he was too heavy. It wouldn't fit him. He was just a teenager. I heard a preacher telling his description of David, said he was just a little auburn-haired teenager with pimples all over his face. It said hanging up dry. He might have weighed, 100 pounds soaking wet, maybe about 5'3", 5'2". And, he was being descriptive. And he said, and here he is, his brother's full grown and older than him. And he's just a shepherd boy, never been in a fight. But what ticked him off is what they were taunting the living God. And David was filled with faith, or either he was stupid, one of the two. But he went out and he confronted the Philistine. And, of course, along the way before he went out there, they tried to give him the sword. And the sword was too big for him to carry. So he said, I'll just use what I've been using all my life. I'll take my slingshot. And, of course, he goes across and he finds a brook out there in the middle. And how many stones did he pick up? 5 stones. Do you think he was going to miss the first time and he needed 4 more shots? No. He had 4 brothers and and no, he needed those extra 4 stones for the brothers. Because if you killed somebody's family back then the family had to avenge your death. So he figured after he killed Goliath. That's pretty good faith there. But I want you to notice he went prepared. So there is a thing about faith. I've met people that, I've heard people call it blind faith. They have faith in God, but then they do stupid things to mess up what God's trying to do. And they go into situations without much prayer, and they just trust in God. It would be like somebody walking out on the highway and saying, well, I have faith that God can deliver me from anything, so I'm going to step in front of this 18-wheeler to prove it. Well, you're going to get killed. That's daring God. That's not kind of faith that David had. He had a practical, common sense, assessed the situation, knew what he was good at, and he also, in his faith, realized there's no such thing as coincidence. That when he went down there, that he would be in this situation. Because he had talked about killing, lions and bears and things that tried to get his sheep. And he had built up within himself confidence that when threatened with him and the Lord, he could do anything. So this is what he tells the Philistine. You come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin. But I come to you in what? I love this. In the name of the Lord. The God of the armies of Israel, whom you have. There's some people, and I've been guilty of this, and rightly so. There's some people say that we shouldn't, in our faith, attack those of opposite faiths that are contrary to the Word of God. We should not be negative toward those that are in power and are doing ungodly things. That we are supposed to be like little mice in a church, just going around trying to find something to eat, and should be because they say we should be meek. There's a time for confrontation. There's a time when the righteous have to stand up, and in American history, of course, Randolph Edmund, or I can't think of his name, but something like that. Anyway, he made a statement. He said, for evil to prevail is for good men to do nothing. And I think that's in the line of this situation. He's making it clear, you've taunted God's armies. They're scared to death of you, but me and the Lord, we're not afraid of you one bit. And it's over, That's a lot of faith for a little teenager with pimples on his face. Okay. So in chapter 16, David is given God's Spirit. He defeats Goliath. The rock hits him in a place where the armor doesn't cover, right here between the eyes. Kills the giant. Then what does he do with Goliath once he hits him with a rock and he falls? Cuts his head off, holds it up. I've seen artists picturing him holding the head up. And, of course, and he used his sword to do it, which it was heavier than Saul's. That's intimidating if you're military and you see a kid come out there and killed your most fierce warrior. But anyway, so we jump to back over here to see a summary of the whole chapter. In chapter 16, David's given God's Spirit. Saul has God's Spirit, departs from Saul, and he's given an evil spirit. So when you are doing God's will and following God and obedient, then this will be the result. God's Spirit will guide you, but in the case of Saul, Saul lost the influence of the Holy Spirit in his life. And, being a pastor for 43 years, I've come across people in my churches that, you hear stories about them, said at one time they were great Sunday school teachers, they were almost in every service, they sung in the choir, and then all of a sudden, some circumstances had happened, and they essentially, and if you went and talked with them, they're miserable. They seem to be depressed. And, a Christian, when they get out of the will of God, one of the things that will happen to you spiritually and mentally is that your mental thinking will become so confused, and you no longer have the Spirit to guide you, so you're trying to find your way without the influence of that. Now, we're in a time in the Old Testament when God's Spirit would come on him and God's Spirit would leave. The difference in the New Testament is God's Spirit never leaves, but you can quench the Spirit, you can hinder the Spirit by disobedience, and you can still have some of the same things that happened to Saul, a digression away from the joy of the Lord, and you can find yourself in a miserable situation where life is not fun anymore, and in some extreme circumstances find yourself thinking, well, the best thing I should do is end my life. And that's what happened to Saul in the end. Chapter 17, David faces Goliath and has victory. Saul fears Goliath. He had the weapons. He was a strong man. And in chapter 18, David is loved by others and even those of Saul's family. So this is the man. Saul tries to murder David and have him killed, chases him off. So David's running from the Philistines. He's running from Saul. He's running from some of his own family. So when you read through Psalms, keep that in mind. A lot of them Psalms was written by David, and you can see why he wrote them. Then David is the fugitive in chapter 19, 20, and 21. David flees from the presence of Saul. In chapter 20, David and Jonathan make a covenant. Now, who was Jonathan? Saul's son. So they become best buds, and they make a covenant together. And David honors that even after Jonathan's out of the picture. David flees to Gath, running from Saul. David in 19 is assisted by, who is this? Michael. Who is he? Huh? Who is this person right here? Huh? Thank you. And how did she get with David? That she was given to him. So it becomes his wife. David gets assistance from the Lord. David and Jonathan make a covenant. David is assisted by Abimelech. And then in 21, David flees to Gath. David assisted by the king of Moab. So the people who were kind of against Israel now are assisting David as he running from Saul. Okay? And keep in mind, he killed Goliath, so he's on their wanted post too. Pretty interesting. Chapter 22, Saul pursues David diligently. In the first pursuit, David encouraged by Jonathan, David assisted by the Lord. In the second pursuit, David cut Saul's robe. Saul and them was in a cave. You remember the story? And, of course, David, he goes in there. Could have killed him, but he just cuts the robe. Just to kind of digress a little bit with American culture and Native Americans, I always thought that the Native Americans, when they were in conflict and stuff, would kill the enemy every time. And in some cases they did. But when a brave was growing up, one of the things in most of the tribes required, he would have to go against someone that's their enemy and cut off something from them and bring it back. That you could get that close to your enemy and take something from them and come back to show that you didn't, even if it was a piece of hair or their head, if you could get them while they were asleep or knock them out and take their hair. But that's to show your bravery. So it's pretty brave to get in a situation where you could end your conflict. And why doesn't David kill Saul? Why didn't he just kill him? I mean, that would have been the easy solution.
Still honored him as king.
He said he would not touch God's anointed.
Saul was asleep when he
What?
Wasn't Saul asleep when he cut his robe?
Yeah, when they were in the cave. Yeah, probably drunk. No, he would have got David. He would have arrested him. He sneaked in there and got everything while he was in there and got away. But he had made it clear. He said, I'm going to let God deal with him because he's God's anointed. And later on, of course, when Elijah is one of the prophets, and then Elisha, and I think it was Elisha that had the bald head, and he was going out, and some kids came up, and there was about 42 of them, and they were mocking him, calling him old bald head, which is a derogatory term for a prophet. And 2 she-bears, female bears, came out of the woods and killed 42 of them. And someone said, don't mess with the preacher, especially if you're out in the forest and you're camping out. Just little jokes that we hear. But David realized that God would deal with Saul, and it was not his position to do that, to be his hand of vengeance. Then he had a third pursuit. Now, in Psalms 57, and we're jumping from Samuel over into some of the things that David wrote, okay? For the choir director set to Al-Tash, that's his tune, it says, of David, when he fled from Saul in the cave, be gracious to me, O God, be gracious to me, for my soul takes refuge in you, and in the shadow of your wings I will take refuge until destruction passes by. So when he's talking about the shadow of the wings, what's he referring to? He's kind of talking, huh? Right, the protection of God. But he's using the vivid picture of a mother bird that in times when they're young or being threatened, the mother bird will actually cover them with their wing. There was a video on Facebook. Somebody showed it, but a farmer's plowing across the field, and in front of him, with that big John Deere, I mean, it was huge. There was a bird with a nest, and the tractor was approaching, and he just kept going, and because he knew the furrows, the blades wouldn't hit; they were wide enough to miss the bird. But that bird did not move and had its wing over the little birds. And then when the tractor went by, it still was there. That's pretty remarkable. God never leaves, just like a situation like that. Now, but you see how Psalms is tying into this? David wrote this. All right. Now, David still is fugitive in chapter 22. Saul still pursuing David. David encouraged by Jonathan and David assisted by the Lord. During the second pursuit, David cuts Saul's robe, and David assisted by Abigail. Now, who's Abigail? Don't say the preacher's wife, because her name's Gail. Who's Abigail? One of David's sisters? All right. All right. Google Abigail on your little Google phone. But y'all just, because once you do it yourself, you know who it is. And what did she do? Which man you talking about?
It meant like madman or something.
Yeah. Who's Abigail? I know. Huh? Nabal's wife?
Yeah.
Is that the right one? There's several. No, there's several Abigails. Which one is this one? Saul's daughter. So, servant to Saul's family or daughter. Now, you said daughter, or did you say servant? Yeah. She's connected with Saul, and Saul, is chasing David, but she steps in just like Jonathan does to spare him. Nabal is what Andy said. Nabal. And who was Nabal? Don't tell me that's the hole in your stomach. Who was Nabal? Abigail's husband. Thank you for that informative. Was there anything about them that stands out? Were they mistreated, or were they just... And she came out and said, don't, and appealed to David not to kill her husband for not helping. And so she pleaded for mercy. I think her husband dies, and I think she becomes a wife of David. That's what I was getting y'all to. He becomes another wife. Yeah, but it's after Nabal died. So he's got Michal, his first wife. Yeah, and he's got Abigail. The what? Well, the thing is, they didn't have malls. They didn't have malls, and they didn't have Amazon, so they didn't have to spend as much taking care of them. No, he was not married to. Like Andy said, that's Nabal's wife, and Nabal refused to come and give David food and whatever. David, when you were put down, like it was your responsibility to do vengeance. She pleaded for him. And David spared him. And then something happened to him. I don't know if he was killed or he just dropped dead. But anyway, Abigail then had no husband, so David took her. Yeah, and it frightened him because she told him what he was going to do. But she intervened, but it was too, he drops dead. Stroke.
Paralyzed on his bed, like a stone, about 10 days
And Abigail becomes David's second wife.
Sounds like a soap opera, don't it?
Yes. Now keep in mind, the Bible says that David was a man after God's own heart. And what does that mean when the scriptures tell us that?
Pretty good fellow.
That's part of it. You're right. David's heart he was a man who wanted to obey God and serve God. But when confronted with his sins, which the Bible shows us, like you said, a soap opera, he had many, he was not unwilling to confess those sins. Psalms 32 and Psalms, what's the other one? Psalms 32, and I think of them. Anyway, there's two Psalms that almost directly appeal to David when he committed, adultery with, Bathsheba and then had her husband killed. 51, there you go, 50, thank you. All right, let's go back to this. Chapter 26, David takes Saul's spear and jug on this one. Here he cuts the robe. Now he's trying to send Saul a message. Dude, I could have wiped you out twice, but I'm not. I'm respecting you, so leave me alone. That's all David wanted. He knew God would deal with him. So when you read the Psalms, you read where David's talking about his enemies and how God delivered him and all this stuff. This is the soap opera that feeds the Psalms. Chapter 27, then David said to Achish, if now I have found favor in your sight, let them give me a place in one of the cities in the country. So he didn't have a place to live. That I may live there, for why should your servant live in the royal city with you? So Achish gave him Ziklag that day, and therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. The number of days that David lived in the country of the Philistines was 1 year and 4 months. So he's now in the territory of the Philistines, who he was poster boy to get rid of, most wanted. This is a picture, and notice the hill. They call these tails, T-E-L, which underneath these tails are probably archaeological areas, walls and stuff, and ever so often they get the right to go in and excavate and deal stuff. In America, going back to American Native Americans, you'll see a lot of these in places of the wilderness areas and stuff where the Native Americans buried their dead and stuff like that, and have archaeological findings there. Now, it came about in those days that the Philistines gathered their armed camps for war to fight against who? Israel. This is the same geographical location right here as Gaza. Same identical. Philistines. That being said, there never has been a country that technically had a group of people that from the beginning of that country were called Palestinians. When the Romans took over, 63 BC and following, and when they began to occupy Israel, they named it Palestine. And so the people that lived there were Jews primarily, and then of course some of the descendants of these people, but they referred to the province as Palestine. So you could technically say then they were Palestinians, but the Gaza people are Arabs and, Islamic. So they don't have a tie back to this land. This land belongs to Israel. But during the times since 1948 when Israel became a nation, Israel gave away land for peace, and they allowed some of these remnants to, stay here. And then, of course, like anything else, you get a nest of ants. If you don't do something with them, they get bigger and bigger. And then Iran started feeding them weapons, and, of course, Hezbollah to the north. So now Israel is surrounded by Iranian terror groups. And that's what Israel is doing, is wiping them out.
Do you think there's a possibility of a two-state solution to the problem? And where would the two states be?
Well, before this broke out, that's basically what you had. Israel did not recognize them as an entity that possessed the land, but they tolerated them to live there. And what the Palestinian people, quote, What they said was, no, we want to have complete control, because with them living there, the Israelis basically had them boxed in. But they also oversaw their government in certain ways, and they restricted them from certain behaviors and even commerce without Israel's approval. So it's kind of like, I don't want to use the same comparison because it's not exactly the same way. When Poland was invaded by the Germans, when it first happened, the Polish people who were there, which were Russians, they recognized they couldn't beat Hitler. So they came to Hitler and said, look, we'll give you half of Poland. You can take the east side of Poland, we'll take the west side, and we'll call it a deal. Well, of course, the Germans, after a year or two, that wasn't enough for them. They wanted all of Poland. Well, what they did in the areas that they had conquered, they put Jewish people in what was known as ghettos. And they boxed off the city, and they allowed them to be there. But what they did by boxing off those ghettos, they controlled how much food went in, how far you could go. They controlled your business. And it was a miserable situation. They say that sometimes the atrocities that Israel has done is not so much killing people, but it's limiting what they can do commercially, what they can do economically, trading, all that stuff. And they're really dependent upon Israel, what goes in and comes out of there. And then, of course, Israel tried to restrict the territories. So what they did, from my understanding, is Hamas infiltrated with Iranian terrorists, built a network of tunnels throughout over 300 miles under this little territory. And so they could go in and hide from the shelling. And then they had certain areas, and so they put their missiles in hospitals, in schools, in places like that to fire their missiles. So when Israel fires back, they hit the hospitals and the schools. And then the word gets out that Israel's killing children and stuff like that.
The Palestinians don't want a two-state solution.
They want the whole thing. Iran wants stuff. They want them done away with. Iran wants them done away with.
Isn't it amazing how in our time, like in my time, how Iran has changed? Iran was our friend.
Yeah.
The Shah was married to an American woman.
Yeah, but see, at that time, the Shia, which is extreme group of the Islamic people, were not in power. They were in Iran, but they were not in power. And then when the Shah had to leave, it's because they had a revolution, and the Shiites, which is the extreme side of Islam, they took over and ran him out. Iraq was governed by Sunnis. Sunnis are more moderate. They follow the Quran, but they're not as strict as Shias are. So that's what happened he had to leave. So when the Khomeini government took over, and of course all the ones that's followed, they've become very radical and adhere to the extreme portions of the Quran that says, kill your enemies, imprison them, tax them, whatever. They literally carry that out, and they're extreme toward women because the Shia follows every letter of the Quran, whereas the Sunnis are a little more moderate, more politically acceptable to other nations, want to trade and do all this stuff. So that's what made it interesting. When you remember Saddam, remember they called him in a hole up there in the Northern Territory. It was unusual for Saddam to become radical. He didn't become a Shia, but the nations surrounding those areas were trying to get him to succumb to the world government that's developing, and he was unwilling to do that. He was trading with people and doing things that, and so they basically, and plus he had human atrocities, but they claimed that he had weapons of mass destruction, which they never found. And they took him out of power. But the Sunnis are still there. The Sunnis are running them, and they're anti-Iranian. And this is what's weird. The Iranians and the Sunnis, which is Iraq, they hate that other group. And you know which group I'm talking about? Not Hezbollah, not Hamas, but what was the group that Trump got rid of? ISIS. And they both hated ISIS, so when ISIS was at its peak, Iranian troops and Iraqi troops were fighting ISIS. Because ISIS is more extreme than the Shia. And their goal is to take both of those countries out and for them to rule both of those countries. And when you trace the ISIS back, they're kind of like the Palestinians. They had no land. They had no military. They were made up of people, ex-military, They had Americans fighting with them. They had Russians fighting with them. They had Syrian. Right. They were a mixture of guys who just like to fight. And they told them that whatever you get is yours, and so they distributed loot. So they lived off all of that, and then they set up bank accounts, and they were being funded by different groups to take down Iran and Iraq and Syria. And so when they got in Syria and tried to take them out, guess who came in to help them? The Russians. It's a very complex thing. But when you trace ISIS back, and I read a book on this, over here in Ethiopia, south of Ethiopia, when you get over to, where's that guy that, what was his name? He's dead now. They killed him, but, no, not Idi Amin, but the other one. Maybe it was Idi Amin. Anyway, he's the one that the terrorists were training in his country. And guess who was training them? CIA. Under Clinton's administration, and it continued under Obama's administration. That whole ISIS thing started down here to take Syria out. And eventually Iran. This is a nightmare. And it's always been said, if you want to control this area, this is how you do it. You arm the side that you want to win, and they'll take care of their enemies, because they see each other as enemies. And the only thing that can bring them together would be for their imam to come, the 12th imam. And just like Jesus is coming back for us, they believe there's a spiritual leader coming, and he's the 12th imam. They call him Isa, I-S-A. And he's the same thing as our Jesus Christ in their terms. And he's going to bring them all together and fight against, the devilish groups, which is America and everything. It's very complex, but it all comes out of this. So David's in a mess here. These weren't Arabs. This is long before the Arabs got started. But this is part of that war and struggle, spiritual war, that goes along. Now, so the Philistines gathered together and came and camped in Shunem, which is up here. Now, let me see if I can get my references right. That's the Sea of, I believe, the Sea of Galilee. So this would be north of Jerusalem. And Saul gathered all Israel together, and they camped in Gilboa in 1 Samuel 28. There's Gilboa. And here's a picture of that. Then Saul disguised himself by putting on other clothes and went, and he and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night. And who is this woman? Endor. What happened during this time frame? Saul is being threatened, and Samuel's died. So Saul says, if I could just talk to Samuel, and Samuel can give me some direction what I need to do in the last days of my life. David's not king yet. So he goes to the witch of Endor. Y'all know that story? And when he's talking to her, he says, I want to talk to the spirit or the ghost, whatever you want to call it, of Samuel. So she gets in her little seance. Guess who shows up? Samuel. His ghost shows up. She is scared to death. She's a con woman. This ain't supposed to happen. She is shook to the core, and Samuel comes up and basically pronounces the final judgment on Saul. Philistines are here, Israelites are here, and then Saul goes up there and talks to the witch of Endor. Then the woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? And he said, brings up Samuel. And when the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice, oh, have mercy. And the woman spoke to Saul, saying, why have you deceived me? For you are Saul. She knew who he was then. He didn't tell her when he went in there. And she was shocked because that had never happened. See, these people who are soothsayers, these people who are the red palm people and tarot cards and all that stuff, they're con artists. You go in there and say they read your palm and all this stuff. No, they ask you certain questions and things, and they gather information because humans have got some basic, commonalities between us. They put together a story that makes you believe that they know what's going on. And there used to be a guy on TV, he did this for a while, and finally they realized, it was back probably in the 80s, I think, when he was on there. And the king said to her, do not be afraid, but what do you see? And the woman said to Saul, I see a divine being, Elohim, coming up out of the earth. And he said to her, what is his form? And she said, an old man is coming up, and he is wrapped with a robe. And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and did homage, which is worship. And it says, as you did not obey the Lord and did not execute his fierce wrath of Amalek, so the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will also give over Israel along with you into the hands of the Philistines. Therefore, tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Indeed, the Lord will give over the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. Now, what's he judging him for? What's he getting Saul about for chasing David? He's going all the way back to when he decided that not to do what God told him to do. What does that say about us? What does that say about us? Has God changed?
We better do what he says.
You think? Pretty, as I use the term, heavy stuff. Thus Saul died with his 3 sons, his armor bearer, and all his men on that day together. Now, the interesting thing about Saul, when he was fighting, he saw that the armies were losing. He was shot with an arrow, but he was still alive. And he told his armor bearer, pulled his sword out and said, kill me, because I do not want to become a prisoner, to the enemy, because they'll take me. And back then what they did was they either quartered them, put pieces all over the country, or as the Assyrians did later, the Syrians would skin them while they're alive and put their hides up and tack them to a wall just with their skin and just leave them there. And he said he didn't want to, have his nakedness exposed, because that was a disgrace. And he didn't want to be in that situation. So the sword bearer said, I will not kill God's anointed. The Bible saw that. Hey guys, drop this anointed thing. We got a critical thing going on here. Somebody kill me. He killed himself. So technically it's one of the first suicides in the Bible. When I've counseled with people, I tell them that, they wonder about suicide and, how God deals with it. And I said, well, God's put in us a strong will to live. And it's there for a reason, because he has a purpose for us. We should never fall into the trap of thinking it's time for me to end my life, when God may take your worst circumstances to bring glory to himself. You need to work yourself through it, trust in the Lord. But there's some people, for various reasons, sometimes mental, sometimes, I've heard people having an aneurysm in the brain, causing a tumor, and they find themselves in distress. But I've had to deal with suicides many times in 43 years. And it's a heartbreaker for people who have a loved one, especially when a young person takes their life. And I've counseled with people who are considering it. And I told them, I said, look, you're trying to play God, and God's not finished with you yet. And I know what you're going through is bad. But it's not for you to decide that. That's for God to decide. And if you are patient and you put the Lord first, he'll get you through this. Saul didn't do that. But he's one of the first ones to commit suicide. Because he's God's anointed, I believe Saul is with God. He's what I would call a perfect example of a backslidden believer who gets out of God's will. And over in 1 John, John says this, that, when you get out of God's will and you start doing your own thing, that your sins that you're committing as a child of God, there's a point where it's called sin unto death, where you finally have reached your limit. And it's kind of like I use the expression of a little hound dog. You put him in the backyard and let him run on the rope, but he knows he can only run so far. God has a limit on how we can live, and if we reach that point, he'll just bring us home. We're his anyway. And that's extreme. But I see this in Saul. Yeah. And who was his son that David took care of? It's a big name. Starts with an M. Right. Now, I think it was about 5 minutes till, so we'll wait the next week. We'll pick up with, y'all remember this Frame 57. Can y'all remember that? I'll leave that there. Anyway.
So, preacher, people have said if you commit suicide, you can go to hell for murder or killing yourself. myself, but then I've heard the argument that God says what's mine no man can take away.
Right.
Man.
The best way to understand that, and remember I told you on Sunday school, well, not you, but them, the Catholic Church, when I took church history in seminary, and then of course I got hooked on it and started studying it, and I found out the Catholic Church has really messed up this world. The only good thing that to me they've really done well is they protected the Word of God. Even though they put it in a language that nobody could read and they controlled it, that's one thing I give them a star for, 5 stars. Other than that, everything else was straight out of hell. The whole concept of Pope stuff. All right. They had in their teachings what they call degrees of hell. And I'll tell you, if you read Dante's comedy, it's not a comedy, but it's in there. He's got a part in there, and it's a poem about hell, and he actually takes the Catholic teachings and he shows the different degrees of hell. At the lowest part of hell, people who committed suicide and Judas Iscariot are there. Because they say when you commit suicide, you can't ask for forgiveness. You committed murder. And so there's no way for you to absolve that sin. So you go to hell. That's not a teaching of what the Bible teaches. There are 4 suicides in the Bible. Saul was one of them. Abimelech, who tried to kill David, did it. Judas Iscariot did it. And this one will probably surprise you, but Samson did it. Samson pulled the temple down. But those are unique circumstances, because in all of those, Abimelech was out to kill anyway, and Judas Iscariot was trying to betray Christ. So those two, essentially ended their lives and probably are in hell as we know it. The other two, Samson and Saul, were believers, but they had fallen back, gotten out of God's will, and the result is they were put in a situation where they could use themselves to win a victory. So, even though they say that when Custer was surrounded by the Native Americans, the Sioux, and of course the Lakotas and others, there was thousands of them. They said that when they went and checked the soldiers to see how they died, most of them shot themselves, the ones that were left. Even Custer, they said, shot himself. Now, they mutilated the bodies and stuff, but they said most of the soldiers, because they knew that if they were caught alive, they would be tortured and stuff. It's not for me to decide where people go. All I know is that God knows our hearts. And if you're feeling despondency to the point that that's something you want to do, then that's Satan, because he's out to kill, steal, and destroy. He's out to disrupt God's will for your life. And thinking, well, I'll just be better off and everybody else would be better off without me. That's self-centeredness. That's you thinking that if you remove yourself, everybody else would be better and you'd be out of your misery. And in fact, what you're doing is you're telling God, you don't know what you're doing and what I'm going through. You don't have a plan for. The opposite is true. God has a plan even in our suffering, because he let Jesus suffer on the cross to do what? To buy our salvation. So you have to have a proper perspective. The Catholic Church is cut and dry. And if a person kills himself, get this, I don't know if they still do this today, but the Catholic Church, if a person kills himself, will cut the head off the body. And you can't be buried in a Christian cemetery. And they bury the head somewhere else and the body somewhere else. For the simple fact that in the afterlife, the Indians did that, thinking if they cut off part of your body, then you couldn't find it, so you'd suffer in the next life. But the Catholic Church does stuff like that. If you want to see a good movie on the Catholic Church and how twisted it was in Crusades, The Kingdom of Heaven is a movie, and I've watched it 6 or 7 times. I've shown it to my classes when I taught church history, and they couldn't believe it. I think it's on Netflix, one of them. It's called The Kingdom of Heaven. And it's about a guy, his wife, because he's all fighting, she doesn't think he's coming back. She gets despondent, and people are giving her a hard time, and she ends up killing herself. When he gets back, he can't even find her body. And he gets ticked. So he goes and kills the priest. And so when he done that, now he goes to another priest. The priest said, well, you got to absolve your sins, and the best thing for you to do is go fight in the Crusades. And, the Pope says you can get a special deal if you go fight for the armies of God. And it's an interesting story. But in the end, and parts of it is true, but it's filled with drama, filled with fighting. And I'll tell you the funny part, and it's not the end of the movie, so I'm not giving away the end. There's a part where the Arabs have Jerusalem surrounded, the First Crusade. and the Christians are piled in there, and they're fixed to be stormed by 200,000 troops, and the Christians are like maybe 50,000, and they have mostly women and children. And so this dude that I was telling you about, absolved his sins, he goes out to talk with Saracen, who's the leader of the, and he's taking a priest with him. And they go out there, and the priest he's like this, he's scared to death. And he said, why don't we just go ahead and convert to Islam and then recant Christianity, and later on, after it's over, we'll come back to Christ. And the guy, and I can't think of the guy's name, he looked at him and said, are you for real? You know, and he goes out and makes a deal with Saracen. Saracen, just give me the city and y'all can leave. And that's what happened. But anyway, it's a good story. But suicide is not something we should desire. That comes from hell. Satan is out to kill, steal, and destroy. And so he's going to get in your mental processes. And you may be going through some difficult times, but none of us have been to Calvary. So we ain't even close to that. So whatever you're going through, it's not you're a child of the King if you're born again. So if those thoughts enter your head, they're not from God, they're from hell. And you need to hear that. And anybody you're talking with about that. And you say, well, you don't know what I'm going through. God does. And he may be permitting that. You know, I look at all I've been through with the cancer and stuff, and suppose I got tired, because some people with cancer, they say, I'm out of here. You know, 17 years ago, I was said I had 3 months to live. If I wasn't a Christian and despondent, I could have said, well, I'll just go ahead and take myself out because I don't want to go through all the chemo and all this stuff. And I didn't want to go through all that. 17 years later, I'm cancer-free. And, you know, and every chance I get, I kick the devil in the teeth saying, look what God has done. So I had a purpose for God, and it's not over yet. So you have to take life in the whole, not in pieces. Because when you're going through something that's pretty bad, that's temporary. And that's what I tell people I've counseled with. I said, what you're going through is temporary. I said, suicide is permanent. There's no coming back. And, you know, for you to be thinking about it is showing that you're following Satan, which is not God's will for your life. Because God wouldn't have that. So I didn't mean to get off on another subject, but, you know, it kind of fits in this. All right, any other questions about the lesson? Yes.
I did want to say that John, I was trying to figure his name, and I knew I said the wrong name. It's Mephibosheth.
There you go. I told you it's a big name, and I didn't even try it. I never have pronounced that one right. That's when I'm in Sunday school, and hey, if I'm in Sunday school and that's a lesson, I call on somebody to read. You do that too, don't you, Ken? Calling somebody else to read. Or do like one of my professors said when you're reading those scriptures, said just get your hand close to your mouth and say, and God told blah, 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 to do blah, 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 and
I can't pronounce the city. I just call it Gloverville.
Gloverville. Sodom and Gomorrah. Real quick, on that line of doing that, my daddy was in sales, and he used to be at McElmurray's down on Broad Street. He was there for years, manager. But he was a salesman before then. Then he went to Maxwell Brothers, and then he went and worked for a Jew in a furniture store. Anyway, one of his salesmen had a hard time remembering names. And Daddy said, well, I can't remember all of them. He said, but if you get to that point, you know, try to do the best you can, write them down, you know. And so Daddy said, this lady come in, and she was a customer, had been there before, bought from. And when she come in, he said, hey, it's so glad to see you, Mr. And Daddy sat over there laughing because he knew what he was doing. He didn't know her name, and so he just, you know. And then when she wrote her, he said, could you fill out this thing here? And that's when he got her name from there on out. So, you know, little tricks of the trade. All right, see you Wednesday night. Let's have prayer. Father, thank you for this day. Lord, the Old Testament, at times for us, it's puzzling. But we know because you're God and you change not, that in that time, for those people, for those circumstances, world level, and this earth and all that dwell therein belong to you. And you have a purpose and you have a will in every event. And some of the things we read tonight, it's hard for us to comprehend this. But this is your world, and you know all things and how things are going to work out. So we trust you that when we read these passages and we're not completely understanding, that we can trust that, Lord, you do what's right every time, and that you never fail in that area. Help us, Lord, as we continue our study to gain a greater insight of your sovereignty, and that we're like pieces of china in your china shop. And sometimes, Lord, you replace those pieces with new pieces. And sometimes you build up, and sometimes you tear down. But we trust you because you are God, and you've proven your love for us. Now, Lord, we pray for those who aren't here tonight for various reasons, for those who are sick. Pray for Deborah and others at home. Continue to strengthen and heal them, and let it be a remarkable healing. And then be with us until we come back together Wednesday night, and guide us in that study, for we ask it in Christ's name. Amen. And we'll be looking primarily at James, the brother of John. There's so much on both of these guys, so we might not get into John because we only have 40 minutes, 45 minutes.